Trump didn't just visit China. Trump went to China hat in hand. And he brought half of Wall Street and Silicon Valley with him on Air Force One. Musk, Jensen Huang, Tim Cook, Larry Fink, the CEOs of Goldman, Boeing, Citigroup, all of them, sitting on the presidential aircraft like they are the government. Because let's be honest, they are the government. Let me be very clear with you. What happened in Beijing this May is one of the most revealing moments in modern American foreign policy history. Not because of what was said in those meetings, but because of what the images told us before a single word was spoken. Trump stepped off Air Force One in Beijing, and standing right beside him were Elon Musk and Jensen Huang. Not generals, not senior diplomats, billionaires, the richest and most powerful corporate executives in the United States. And that single image, more than any press release or diplomatic statement, told you everything you need to know about who actually runs American foreign policy and what this trip was truly about. Now, I want you to think carefully about something that the mainstream American media glossed over almost entirely. It was the United States that requested this meeting, not China. Washington picked up the phone. Beijing answered. And that distinction matters enormously. In diplomacy, in military affairs, in any negotiation, the party that initiates the meeting is typically the party that needs something. The party that needs something does not have the leverage. And in this case, the United States needed something very badly. The American economy is under serious strain, and the people in Washington who actually set policy, the billionaire donors, the corporate executives, the Wall Street financiers, they are feeling it. And so Trump, who has never been known for subtlety, made it as obvious as possible by posting on his Truth Social platform a list of the corporate CEOs who would be traveling with him to China on Air Force One. Jensen Huang of Nvidia, Elon Musk, the richest man on earth, Tim Cook of Apple, whom Trump famously calls Tim Apple, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, Stephen Schwarzman, the CEO of Blackstone, the world's largest alternative asset manager, who also happens to be the highest paid executive on Wall Street and was a major donor to Trump's presidential campaign. And then the CEOs of Boeing, Cargill, Citigroup, GE Aerospace, Goldman Sachs, Micron, and Qualcomm. These are the most powerful corporations in America, and their chiefs were sitting on the presidential aircraft, traveling to meet the leadership of a foreign government as though they themselves were American government officials, because in a very real sense, they are. And this was not even slightly subtle. When Trump met with President Xi, the photographs published by the American media showed the usual government officials you would expect. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, David Perdue, the ambassador to China, a man who before entering politics was the president of Reebok and then the chairman and CEO of Dollar General, a Fortune 500 CEO who became a senator and is now America's top representative in Beijing. But also visible in those photographs, standing in the room during a meeting between the heads of state of the two most powerful nations on earth, were Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia, and Stephen Schwarzman, the CEO of Blackstone. Corporate executives present in a presidential diplomatic meeting. Trump did the same thing at his inauguration when he seated Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and the CEOs of Google and Apple alongside his cabinet officials. The message has been consistent and it has been unmistakable. American government policy, foreign policy, domestic policy, economic policy is made by and for large corporations and the billionaire class that owns them. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is simply what Trump is showing you with his own actions, because, as I said, the man has no subtlety whatsoever. So why exactly were all of these corporate titans so desperate to get to Beijing? The answer comes down to one fundamental reality about the modern global economy. China has 1.4 billion people. It is the second most populous country on earth, and it has the world's largest middle class in absolute numbers. more than 800 million people whose collective spending power amounts to approximately $7.4 trillion. That is a consumer market larger than the American middle class, larger than India's middle class, larger than any other middle class on Earth. And the trade war that the United States government has been waging against China, a bipartisan effort that began under Obama, accelerated under Trump's first term, continued under Biden, and then exploded under Trump's second term, has been cutting American corporations off from that enormous market, and they are desperate to get back in. Nvidia is perhaps the clearest example of this desperation. Jensen Huang has made multiple trips to China over the past several years. He has been almost visibly anxious about the situation, and the reason is simple and devastating. Just a few years ago, Nvidia controlled 95% of the Chinese market for advanced chips. 95%. Today, that number is zero. The company went from total dominance to complete exclusion in a handful of years. And this happened because the United States government, under Trump in his first term and then continued aggressively under Biden, imposed sweeping restrictions on the export of advanced semiconductors to China. The stated rationale was national security, the idea being that if you prevent China from accessing the most advanced chips, you prevent China from developing world-class artificial intelligence capabilities, and you maintain American technological superiority. It sounded logical to the people in Washington who designed it. What actually happened was something very different. China did not simply accept this technological embargo and fall behind. The Chinese government mobilized enormous resources, billions of dollars in subsidized loans, direct government investment, national industrial policy on a massive scale, to develop a domestic semiconductor industry. And China made remarkable progress in a very short period of time. China is not yet producing chips at the absolute cutting edge, the 3-nanometer and 5-nanometer chips that represent the pinnacle of what Nvidia and Taiwan's TSMC can manufacture. But China now thoroughly dominates the global market for what are called legacy chips, slightly larger but still highly capable semiconductors used in an enormous range of applications. And the trajectory is clear to anyone willing to look at it honestly. China is catching up. And it is entirely plausible that within the coming years, China will not only match American chip capabilities, but will surpass them in certain areas. So the chip war did not cripple China's technology sector. It cost American companies like Nvidia billions of dollars in lost revenue and lost market share, and it turbocharged China's own domestic chip development. Another American pressure campaign that produced the opposite of its intended result. Apple presents a different but equally instructive story. Tim Cook has been flying to China regularly for years, trying to manage an almost impossibly complicated situation. Apple's entire manufacturing operation is built around China. The supply chains, the component suppliers, the skilled labor force, the logistical infrastructure, all of it centered in China. The American government, under every administration since Obama, has been pressuring Apple and other major American corporations to de-risk their China exposure, to diversify their manufacturing to other countries, particularly India. And Apple has genuinely tried. There have been real investments in Indian manufacturing, but the results have been limited, and the progress has been painfully slow. Because what China has built over the past 3 decades is not easily replicated anywhere else on Earth. China alone accounts for approximately 1/3 of all global manufacturing output. 1/3. That is more than the United States, Japan, Germany, and South Korea combined. And it is not simply a matter of cheap labor, which is the simplistic explanation that American commentators have relied on for decades. It is about an ecosystem. It is about the thousands of domestic Chinese companies that supply every component, every tool, every raw material. It is about infrastructure, logistics, industrial clustering, and a workforce that has developed extraordinary skills in precision manufacturing. You cannot simply pick that up and move it to another country in a few years, possibly not in a few decades. And then there is Tesla and Elon Musk. And this story is perhaps the most revealing of all, precisely because of the contradictions involved. Musk is the world's richest man. He was the single largest donor to Trump's 2024 presidential campaign. He served as a top figure in the Trump administration before a political falling out and then what appears to be a reconciliation. And he was on Air Force One flying to Beijing with Trump. Now here's what makes this so illustrative. More than half of all Tesla electric vehicles are manufactured at the Gigafactory in Shanghai, China. Over 50% of the product of the company Musk runs is made in China. At the same time, Musk lobbied the American government aggressively for protectionist trade barriers to shield Tesla from Chinese electric vehicle competition in the American market. And Biden, responding to that pressure, announced 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in 2024. 100%. This makes it essentially impossible for Chinese EV manufacturers to sell cars in the United States at competitive prices. So what you have is the following situation. Musk manufactures his cars in China, uses those Chinese facilities to keep his costs down and supply the global market, and simultaneously uses his political influence to ensure that Chinese competitors cannot enter the American market and compete with him. This is not free market capitalism. This is using government power to protect your own position while simultaneously benefiting from the very country whose companies you are trying to exclude. And yet, despite all of these protectionist barriers, BYD, the Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer, has overtaken Tesla as the top seller of electric vehicles globally. The Ford CEO has been publicly warning that Chinese automakers have the capability to put every American car company out of business. And the Ford CEO himself drives a Chinese electric vehicle made by Xiaomi, which tells you that he knows exactly how good these cars are. Now, I need to talk about the rare earth situation because this is something that does not get nearly enough attention in American public discourse, and it should. It is one of the most significant strategic vulnerabilities the United States has, and most Americans have no idea it exists. Rare earth elements are a group of metals that are essential components in virtually every advanced technology that exists. Artificial intelligence hardware, consumer electronics, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and critically, military weapon systems, fighter jets, missiles, radar systems, guided munitions, the advanced weaponry that the American military-industrial complex produces and that American military power depends upon. All of it requires rare earth elements. And China does not just play a significant role in rare earth production. China utterly dominates it. For manganese, graphite, and rare earth magnets, there is essentially no alternative global supplier chain at meaningful scale. And it goes beyond rare earths. In copper, nickel, aluminum, lithium, and cobalt, materials that are critical for advanced manufacturing and clean energy technology, China plays an enormous and in some cases irreplaceable role in global production and processing. When China announced export restrictions on these materials as a direct response to the aggressive American tariff campaign of 2025, it sent genuine shockwaves through Washington because the implications were immediate and serious. The same corporations that the American military relies upon to build its weapon systems suddenly faced potential shortages of materials they cannot get elsewhere. The American military's ability to sustain its production of advanced weaponry came into question, and the technology companies, the Nvidias and the Apples, and the companies building AI data centers, they are also dependent on these same materials. So with a single policy announcement, China simultaneously threatened American military production capacity and American technology sector competitiveness. That is what leverage looks like. That is why Foreign Policy magazine said that China's rare earth card looms over the entire Trump-Xi summit. And this is why American administrations going back years have been desperately trying to build alternative supply chains. Marco Rubio, back in early 2025, when he was still in his first weeks as Secretary of State, organized what was called the Critical Minerals Ministerial, inviting representatives of dozens of countries to Washington to try to coordinate the creation of a global supply chain for critical minerals that would reduce dependence on China. The Trump administration also launched an initiative called Pax Silica, working with allied nations to develop alternative mineral supply chains with a particular emphasis on shipping and high-tech manufacturing. India was pressured to join this initiative, with promises that American corporations would shift their manufacturing from China to India. All of this is real effort, but it is going to take years, possibly a decade or more. And in the meantime, the dependence on China is not going away. Let me step back and put all of this in a broader strategic context, because I think it is important to understand how we arrived at this moment. For the past decade, while American policymakers were congratulating themselves on how much pressure they were putting on China, China was doing something very deliberate and very smart. China was diversifying. In the 1990s, roughly 1/4 of China's total trade was with the United States. China was genuinely dependent on American market access. A threat to cut off that access would have been serious leverage. But starting around 2016, China began systematically reducing that dependence. China deepened its trade relationships with the nations of Southeast Asia, with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. China expanded its economic ties across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. China built the Belt and Road Initiative into a genuine global infrastructure and trade network. And by 2025, China was trading more with ASEAN alone than with the United States or with the entire European Union. The American market, while still significant, was no longer China's economic lifeline. So when Trump came in with his Liberation Day tariffs in April 2025, and at the peak he had imposed 145% tariffs on Chinese goods, which is essentially a trade embargo, the assumption in Washington was that this would cause catastrophic economic pain in China and force Beijing to negotiate and make concessions. Scott Bessent, the Wall Street hedge fund billionaire who Trump made Treasury Secretary, went on television and said with complete confidence that the United States held all the cards, that China was playing a losing hand. I have spent my entire career studying adversaries, and I will tell you that this kind of arrogance, this failure to accurately assess the actual capabilities and position of your adversary, is how great powers make catastrophic strategic mistakes. Bessent was wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. Because China did not fold. China fought back. China imposed proportional, reciprocal tariffs on American goods. China announced the rare earth export restrictions. And then China went further still, invoking for the first time its anti-sanctions blocking laws and ordering all Chinese domestic companies to ignore and defy American sanctions entirely. China began constructing a parallel financial and trade architecture in which American sanctions simply do not apply, in which the dollar-denominated financial system that Washington has used as a weapon for decades has no power. That is a profound and long-term strategic development whose implications will be felt for generations. And then there is Iran, which is a separate catastrophe, but one that is deeply connected to the Beijing summit and to the overall strategic picture. I opposed the Iran war from the beginning, and I said so publicly, not because I have any sympathy for the Iranian government, but because I understand military reality and the idea that you could bomb a nation of 90 million people, eliminate its leadership, and install a compliant puppet government in a matter of weeks was simply not connected to any serious analysis of what Iran actually is as a nation and as a military power. That was a fantasy produced by people who have never had to think seriously about what war actually costs. But beyond the military miscalculation, there appears to have been a broader strategic theory behind the Iran war, and understanding that theory helps explain everything that happened afterward. In January of 2025, the Trump administration moved against Venezuela, seizing President Maduro and threatening to cut off Venezuelan oil exports. China purchases the vast majority of Venezuelan oil. Then, weeks later, the United States attacked Iran. China purchases approximately 80% of Iranian oil. China is Iran's largest trading partner. The apparent logic was to knock out both Venezuela and Iran, cut off a significant portion of China's oil supply, because China is the world's largest oil importer and is heavily dependent on foreign energy, and then walk into Beijing with genuine leverage. The message would be, give us the trade and economic concessions we are demanding, or we control your energy supply. But the plan collapsed. The Iranian government did not fall. The Iranian military and its affiliated forces proved far more resilient than the planners in Washington anticipated. The war dragged on, and instead of creating American leverage over China, what it created was the largest oil price shock in history. Crude oil prices roughly doubled. Gasoline prices in the United States skyrocketed. And this matters enormously for American working families in ways that ripple through the entire economy. The United States is a country that was built around the automobile. Public transportation is minimal outside of a handful of major cities. The overwhelming majority of Americans must drive to get to work, to get to school, to buy groceries, to access any of the basic necessities of daily life. When gasoline prices double, the cost of simply existing as a working person in America increases dramatically and immediately. And it does not stop there. Every good that is transported to a store, which is every good that anyone buys, moves by truck. And trucks run on fuel. So when fuel prices double, the cost of transporting goods doubles. And that cost is passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices on food, on clothing, on everything. Inflation, which was already a serious problem that Trump had specifically promised to solve, got significantly worse as a direct consequence of a war that was supposed to strengthen America's negotiating position with China. American inflation is now approaching 4%. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, has a target inflation rate of 2%. America is running nearly double the target rate. And that 4% figure is probably conservative. Real consumer inflation, as experienced by working families, is almost certainly higher when you account for the full range of goods and services they actually purchase. And Trump's approval rating has fallen to 36%. 36%. That is a number that reflects genuine and widespread dissatisfaction among the American public. And it should not be surprising when you understand the economic reality that most Americans are living through. Because here is the deeper historical context that is essential for understanding why this moment is so painful for so many Americans. Since the 1970s, for more than half a century, real wages for American workers, meaning wages adjusted for inflation, have been essentially stagnant. The average American worker has not experienced meaningful purchasing power growth in 50 years. Meanwhile, wages and compensation for the wealthiest Americans have increased dramatically. And when you look at wealth rather than just income, the inequality is even more extreme. The richest Americans have accumulated wealth on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend, while the majority of Americans live paycheck to paycheck without meaningful savings, one unexpected medical bill or car repair away from financial crisis. Now, here is something that most people do not fully appreciate. One of the main reasons that American workers did not feel as economically squeezed as they actually were during these decades of wage stagnation is that China was effectively subsidizing the American standard of living. As American factories closed and American workers lost manufacturing jobs and real wages stagnated, the goods that working families needed to buy, televisions, clothing, furniture, toys, electronics, all of those things got dramatically cheaper because they were being manufactured in China at a fraction of what it would cost to produce them domestically. China was exporting deflation into the American economy. This kept measured inflation relatively low, even as wages stopped growing, which meant that working families could still afford to fill their homes with consumer goods, even as their economic position was actually deteriorating in other important ways. China was, in a very real sense, masking the consequences of American deindustrialization and financialization for the American working and middle class. But the services that China cannot manufacture and export, housing, healthcare, childcare, college tuition, hospital bills, those became the province of American financial interests. Investors bought up housing stock and turned it into a speculative asset class. The healthcare system was organized around profit extraction rather than patient outcomes. College tuition increased at rates far exceeding general inflation for decades. And all of these essential services, the ones that determine whether a family can live with stability and dignity, became extraordinarily expensive, precisely because they could not be offshored and so could not benefit from the deflationary effect of Chinese manufacturing. The result is what economists now call the K-shaped economy. At the top, asset prices boom. The stock market breaks records. Billionaires accumulate wealth at extraordinary rates. At the bottom and in the middle, working families struggle with housing costs, healthcare costs, childcare costs, and educational costs that have spiraled far beyond what their stagnant wages can comfortably support. And now the trade war has taken away even the one thing that was keeping consumer goods affordable. Tariffs on Chinese goods mean that the televisions and the clothing and the furniture and the electronics, the things that were cheap because China made them, are becoming more expensive. The one buffer that ordinary Americans had against the full consequences of 50 years of wage stagnation is being removed. And it is being removed not to benefit American workers, or to rebuild American manufacturing, or to create good jobs, all of which would take a decade of serious, sustained industrial policy to accomplish, even if the political will existed to do it, but to create negotiating leverage for the corporations whose executives were sitting on Air Force One flying to Beijing. Trump's tariffs are a consumption tax. They fall most heavily on the people who spend the highest proportion of their income on physical goods. That means poor people and working-class people pay proportionally more. Meanwhile, Trump's tax cuts on the wealthy reduce the burden on the people who are already the most economically comfortable. This is not a trade policy designed for the benefit of American workers. It is a trade policy designed for the benefit of the billionaire class, which is also imposing enormous costs on working Americans as a side effect. And the profound irony of this entire situation is that the very corporations whose demands are driving American foreign policy, whose CEOs were on that plane to Beijing, are also the corporations that made the strategic decisions over the past 3 decades to move American manufacturing to China, to build their supply chains around Chinese labor and Chinese infrastructure, to optimize their profit margins by offshoring production, and in doing so to hollow out the American industrial base and to eliminate the good manufacturing jobs that once sustained the American working and middle class. And now those same corporations are working with the American government to negotiate a return to market access in China, to recover the revenue they lost from the chip restrictions and the trade war, to secure the deals that serve their shareholder interests. The average American worker is not in any of those meetings. The average American worker is not on Air Force One. The average American worker is paying higher prices at the grocery store and higher prices at the gas pump and watching their purchasing power erode while being told that all of this is being done for their benefit. Now let me turn to what actually happened at the summit, or at least what the available information suggests happened, because full diplomatic disclosure is rare and these negotiations are ongoing. What we know is that in October 2025, Trump met with President Xi and they agreed to a 1-year truce in the trade war. And the circumstances of that truce tell you everything about the actual balance of power in this relationship. After nearly a decade of American trade war against China, starting in 2018, continuing through Biden, exploding under Trump's second term, after all of that pressure and all of those tariffs and all of those chip restrictions and all of those sanctions, the United States was the one that needed relief. The American economy could not sustain the full weight of the trade war it had launched, and so the United States agreed to a truce on terms that China found acceptable. That is not a victory. That is a strategic defeat that American policymakers are trying very hard to dress up as something else. The May 2026 summit in Beijing is a continuation of that story. One of the major issues on the agenda is the rare earth export restrictions that China announced in response to American pressure. American technology companies and American military contractors need those materials. They cannot get them elsewhere in the short term. So American negotiators are trying to get China to lift or ease those restrictions. In return, the United States is presumably offering various concessions, perhaps easing some of the chip export restrictions that have been cutting Nvidia out of the Chinese market, perhaps adjusting some of the tariff levels, perhaps making commitments about not escalating sanctions on Chinese companies in the oil and petrochemical sectors. These negotiations are about the Americans trying to recover some of what they gave up by starting a trade war they could not win, and the Chinese deciding how much of it to give back and at what price. And China's position is strong for all the reasons I have already discussed. But there is one more dimension here that I want to address, which is the question of China's own sanctions countermeasures. For years, the United States used sanctions as a primary tool of economic coercion. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency and America's dominance of the international financial system gave Washington enormous power to cut countries and companies off from the global economy, simply by designating them. Iran knows this. Russia knows this. Venezuela knows this. This power was real, and for a long time it was quite effective. But overuse of any weapon diminishes its effect, and the aggressive American sanctioning of China-linked companies has pushed Beijing to develop countermeasures. China has now invoked for the first time its anti-sanctions blocking legislation, which legally requires Chinese companies to ignore and defy American sanctions. China is working with other countries that also face American sanctions to build alternative payment systems, alternative trade networks, alternative financial architecture that operates outside the dollar system. This is a long-term project, and it is not complete, but the direction is clear. And every time Washington uses sanctions aggressively, it accelerates the development of these alternatives and makes the dollar's privileged position in the global economy slightly less secure. The instrument that gave American foreign policy much of its power is being blunted by overuse. I want to say something now about Marco Rubio, because his presence at this summit represents something historically remarkable that deserves to be noted. When Rubio was a senator, he was one of the most aggressively hawkish voices in the United States government on China. He was so hostile to Beijing, so extreme in his position, that the Chinese government actually sanctioned him personally as part of a tit-for-tat exchange after the U.S. sanctioned Chinese officials. The man was on a personal sanctions list in China, and now he is sitting across the table from Chinese officials as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, the two most senior positions in American foreign policy. And his rhetoric has softened substantially, not because his fundamental views have changed, presumably, but because he is now dealing with reality rather than the comfortable fantasy available to a senator who can take maximalist positions without having to execute them. Reality has a way of doing that to people. When you actually have to manage the relationship, when you understand what leverage China has and what the United States actually needs from Beijing in the short term, the speeches you used to give start to seem less useful. The broader lesson of all of this, and I believe this is the lesson that serious American strategists need to absorb, even though many of them will resist it, is that the theory of American dominance that has driven U.S. foreign policy for the past 30 years is no longer accurate as a description of the world. The United States remains enormously powerful. It has the largest economy in the world, the most powerful military, extraordinary technological capabilities, and deep cultural and institutional strengths. None of that has disappeared. But the world has changed. China has risen. Not in the way that American analysts of the 1990s imagined. Not as a country that would gradually become more like America as it got richer, but on its own terms, with its own model, maintaining its own political system, and developing its own technological and industrial capabilities. The Global South has found alternatives to American-led institutions. American sanctions have pushed more and more countries to develop workarounds to the dollar system. And the United States has spent enormous political and economic capital on pressure campaigns that have largely backfired, strengthening the very adversaries they were designed to weaken. Arrogance is the most dangerous quality in a strategist or a statesman. The assumption that you hold all the cards, that your adversary has no options, that maximum pressure will produce capitulation. This kind of thinking has driven American policy toward China for years, and the results are visible in the photograph of Trump stepping off Air Force One in Beijing with his billionaire entourage, hoping to negotiate his way back into a market that American policy inadvertently pushed China to close off. The results are visible in the chip industry, where a decade of restrictions produced a Chinese domestic semiconductor industry that barely existed before. The results are visible in the rare earth situation, where China now has more strategic leverage over American military production than any adversary has had in decades. Going forward, what the United States needs is honest strategic assessment. Not triumphalism, not the kind of chest thumping that tells American voters that we hold all the cards when we manifestly do not. What is needed is a clear-eyed understanding of where American leverage actually exists and where it does not. A realistic appreciation of Chinese capabilities and Chinese strategic options, and a foreign policy that is designed in the genuine national interest, rather than in the interest of the corporations whose executives ride on Air Force One. Whether that kind of sober strategic recalibration is possible in the current political environment, given all of the domestic pressures and political incentives that push in the other direction, is a question I genuinely cannot answer with confidence. What I can tell you with confidence is what happened in Beijing this May. The United States went to China because it needed something. It needed access to markets. It needed rare earth materials. It needed some relief from a trade war that was hurting the American economy and the American people more than it was hurting China. And China had the leverage to extract a price for providing that relief. The Council on Foreign Relations said China had the upper hand. Former officials from the State Department and the National Security Council said America had lost its leverage. And the image of the American president standing in Beijing, flanked by billionaires, asking for a deal, told you the same story without a single word being spoken. That is where we stand. And until American policy is made for the American people, rather than for the people on that airplane, that is roughly where we are going to keep ending up. That is the reality of this situation as I see it, and as the evidence clearly shows. Draw your own conclusions.